All right, well then, we will commence. I'd like to welcome everyone to the September 19th Finance Committee meeting of the Board of Directors of the School District of Upper Dublin. We are going to call this meeting to order, and the first thing we have right off the bat is a presentation from PFM. We have Jamie Doyle here, so welcome her.
Good evening, it's a pleasure to be here this evening.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here this evening, and believe it or not, it is time to talk about the calendar year 2020 Plan of Finance. Hard to believe. So you each have a copy of my handout, and I'm very excited on page 1 to share with you that we just set new all-time low interest rates on August 28th. So as always, page 1 is 3 different snapshots of the same index. It's the 10-year MMD curve, which stands for Municipal Marketplace Data. The top chart shows you the blue line. The yield curve is still very, very flat.
Do you have newer copies in color?
I do, absolutely.
You usually do.
I do.
Thank you.
I knew you would.
That'll give me a chance to scroll, because I forget to do that sometimes.
I think you might be running out of colors pretty soon.
Never.
No.
Okay, so the blue line, the yield curve is still very, very flat, which is great. Even though the Federal Reserve Committee decreased short-term rates for the second time yesterday, you're still earning a little bit more than you had been in quite a while on your investments, and most importantly, the long end of the yield curve is staying very, very low, which is very important to your borrowing plan. The middle chart just shows the same index going all the way back to 1998, so you can see the old all-time lows were in the summer of 2016, and you can see on the far right-hand side where we currently are. And then the bottom is just a blow-up of that little red box in the middle chart, so you can get a better idea of what exactly has happened to interest rates. Really, since November of 2018, they've done nothing but decline. Now we are seeing things back up just a little bit, because everybody has a refunding that works when rates hit all-time lows. So there's a lot of supply coming, but I think some of that will probably clear out by the time it's time to lock your rates in. If you look at page 2, we are, of course, still talking about your Sandy Run Middle School project. And as always, our analysis assumes no state reimbursement and that you may apply for grants toward the project. In that next section, this has not changed at all, federal tax laws. You need to have reasonable expectations that you can spend 85% of the proceeds within 3 years, which we're going to look at your updated draw schedule in a moment, and that's absolutely not a problem. In fact, you're spending money pretty quickly at this stage of the game, and in fact, we are going to talk about the next section in greater detail, the reimbursement resolution. Because we spend a lot of time, we've been trying to stay with this bank qualified plan of 10 million or less per calendar year as long as we can. And we think we can do that again for 2020. You may end up going over a little bit, and that's why that reimbursement resolution is critical to the plan, and that will preserve your flexibility and your right to reimburse yourself from a 2021 issue. Because we're going to have a non-bank qualified greater than $10 million issue at some point. That might be in 2021, but this plan has been working great for you, especially as the interest rate environment has really cooperated. So in that third section, the maximum parameters resolution, that's the way we've been proceeding with each step of the plan, where you put in place those maximum parameters, and then we can enter the market on the best day possible, as opposed to being led to a board meeting day when you would meet that night. That parameters resolution will set forth the maximum principal amount, maximum interest rate, and maximum final maturity per state law. And then you don't need to hold any special meetings. We can best day available. Sample timeline at the bottom of page 2. We're having the Finance Committee discussion this evening. Authorization to proceed, if you so choose, could be at your October 28th voting meeting or later. We could be back with that parameters resolution at your November 25th voting meeting, and and then that would position you to be one of the first issuers out of the gate in January, which historically has been advantageous. There gets to be a lot of pent-up demand from investors because nothing really happens the last 2 weeks of December. So they're all raring to go come January. And then that would settle in mid-February if we proceeded on that timeline. If you look at page 3, you'll see your existing debt portfolio. As always, the top half is gross debt service, meaning principal and interest. The bottom half is your local share, net of state reimbursement to varying degrees on most of your issues. And as always, I monitor this page for refinancing opportunities if they become available to you. The good news and the bad news that I've shared with you on several occasions is that you have very low interest rates in this debt portfolio, so no viable refunding opportunities at this point in time. If you look at page 4, this is your updated draw schedule that we've worked on with your architects and your administration. And so it has a lot of columns and a lot of teeny tiny numbers that I'm sure you can't read on the screen because I can barely read them on the page. But the point being, in column 12, you'll see in 2020 an anticipated roughly $9.8 million of proceeds coming into the construction fund with this issue that we're talking about this evening. And you will see, if you look at column 17, that we may get into the red a little bit at the end of 2020. And again, that's where that reimbursement resolution comes into play, because you would front the money temporarily from your reserves and then reimburse yourself once the 2021 issue settles. And as you look down column 12, you can see it is pretty likely that the greater than 10 million non-bank qualified issue will occur in 2021 based on what we know at this point in time.
Questions as we go, or?
I'm sorry? Yeah, absolutely.
I don't know if it's for you or for Andy, but why is it that the total on the draw schedule is 80 million rather than 75?
So there's some in and out transfers with your escrows, and that would be why. Really proceed-wise, column 12 is your bond proceeds, and then we are anticipating some interest earnings conservatively in column 15.
And the only thing I would add to that is this is not a budget. This is a cash flow document, right?
Exactly.
So the 4.4 million we showed on both sides, just because of how large it is, it does have a large impact on our cash flow with the project. So that's why it says 80 versus 76.
Great question. If you look at page 5, that should look familiar. So columns 1 and 2 are the steps we already did. They're labeled actual, and we're talking about step 3 this evening, $9,995,000. Same structure, a pro rata wraparound, meaning as some of your old debt pays off in column 8, we start to fill in with the new debt to keep your payments level or declining and as low as possible up front. And so, we're always conservative this early on in the process, but if you look down below in column 13, you can see the estimated annual payments are about $400,000 a year. You'd do better than this if we were having a sale today. And then you can also see in column 4, next year, we have to have this exact same conversation next fall, and that may be the larger issue at that point in time. Are there any questions on page 5? If not, on page 6.
Wait.
Sorry.
So in the past, we've had the gross millage equivalent column, and then we had 2 other columns, which had to do with millage in hand, or millage we were going to use. I mean, I've asked some of these questions a little bit. I think I might know what some of the answers, but I think it would be good to go over them again. Some of the things that, I know you can allocate your money to one thing or another thing, but you can't use it twice. So is this a recommendation decision from the administration not to use the money that we had budgeted to pay for debt for Sandy Run because we need it for something else? Or I guess that's my question.
So the way I would answer that question is, in 1920, the budget that's currently in place, the board passed a budget that had expenditures exceeding revenues by $3.2 million. So to say that millage is in place, I mean, I understood and where the millage in place and where all those numbers came from. But from my perspective, the way I look at the budget is it's not really in place because we have a large deficit between expenses and revenues. So it's not necessarily a reallocation or that we're using money one way or another. If you just strip everything out of that discussion and say expenses are 103 million and revenues are 100 million, we have a $3 million gap that we need to figure out how to close.
But sure, but some of those expenses are actually transfers to either capital projects or debt service, which in the past we've said instead of transferring to capital projects or debt service, we would use it to pay this new debt.
Correct.
That's what I think Joe was asking.
Correct, but 1.4 million is in the budget for transfer. And the conversation was that one, when we were originally looking at this, the conversation was that 1.4 million would now become an expense to pay the increased debt service.
Right.
So it's not just found money, it's money that was already set aside to become an expense.
Yes.
So you're starting from 3 million next year, even though we're not transferring any money next year.
So I'm not sure that answered your question, Joe. I mean,
I'm not, how else can I help explain the answer? I mean, we have $3 million that is a deficit between revenues and expenses that we need to close.
And that's counting, allocating the money that we had said we would allocate to debt service.
right, so.
Allocating it to debt service?
So we're moving the 1.4 million, we're transferring it in the budget this year to the capital reserve. Correct? Next year it's scheduled to become an expense.
Next year being 2021.
The 2021 budget. I mean, as it was sort of laid out, that 1.4 million would become an expense.
Right.
In other words, would be used to pay.
Debt
To pay
service.
debt service.
Yeah.
But not in the budget this year.
It's in the budget this year to
To
be
be
transferred to capital reserve, that's correct.
Okay. I guess I understand what you're saying. But it's a different way of looking at this than we did in the past.
I agree with that,
Okay.
yes.
Jamie, step 3, what we're looking at now, I know you're very conservative. If nothing changed between now and January, those numbers would better be reflected when we look at step 2. I mean, is that
Yeah,
would be the better scenario?
yes.
Maybe even a little
A little
better,
better.
a little bit better. Yeah, I was surprised in step 5 you're a lot more, you weren't as conservative with the last tranche for some reason.
It's a lot further away. It's not until 2022.
Right. And so step 3 is, if things remain the same, I think we would be looking more like column 11.
And if I could go back, yes, but if I could go back to step 5, this plan was designed, it goes out the same, maximum length in time, if you will, but it's the last step, so it starts later, obviously, so that's part of it. It's not that I'm being less conservative, it's just a shorter issue than some of the others.
Oh, okay. It's not
If
23
you're
years
just
or
looking
20.
at the interest estimate line,
Right, okay.
It's
okay.
shorter.
It's shorter. That's where it is.
I have a question, Jamie, about the overall structure. Given the incredibly low rates as they are today, I understand that may not be true in January. Would it make sense, instead of doing a bank qualified one now, to do the big one or a big one now?
we've had this conversation, I think each step, and it's a great conversation to have each and every time. And you've done very well by this bank qualified plan. I mean, the
Well,
experts,
the
and I
odds of-
certainly can't
The
predict
odds of
interest rates.
refunding
but-
this in 5 years when the rates are this low seem low.
Yeah, but
You know.
5 years go by, passage of time, you're 5 years shorter on the yield curve. I mean, we're refunding things that we thought we'd never refund again, that we, issued 5 years ago. We're doing that right now. So, I mean, I think staying the course with the bank qualified plan is very prudent. I mean, we thought interest rates were low in 2018 at the beginning, and we talked about issuing it all at one time and comparing, and I'm really glad we didn't do that right now.
Okay, that's a fair point. Also, the 2012 issues where we passed the call date, are we not refunding them because it doesn't pay to refund them, or because we can't if we want to do a bank qualified?
It doesn't pay to refund them,
Okay.
because there's exceptions you can take against current period refundings when they're past the call date, so that only a small portion of them counts towards your bank qualified limits, which we've done in the past. So if at some point in time it does make sense to refund them, I will certainly bring that to your attention.
Okay, so it has nothing to do with the timing of bank qualified, or little to do
No,
at least?
there's
Yeah,
strategies to
okay,
plan for that.
thank you.
Just two more questions. As you always do, the interest, right now I think we're collecting around 2% on the,
That's a good estimate.
right, so again, you're conservative here in column whatever.
Right,
So it could be more.
yes,
Could be more.
absolutely.
Okay, and then, you probably don't have this answer yet, but one of the items in our budget is the bond financing, I guess it's called, and we budgeted 1.4 million. When will we see, I mean, will we not know a better number? I mean, could it be more, how much more could it be, how much less? Because we are doing an additional borrowing, could that number increase, or could it?
Well, yes, that number could increase, but it's more than offset by the decrease in your debt service. I mean, we have, a running tally on the
Yeah.
steps that we've already completed, but we won't really know the true answer until after we complete the final step.
Right, because with the two steps, it's 356,000 so far. I'm just wondering,
I
we won't
mean,
know until the end.
rough rule of thumb, and you will come in under this because of your good credit rating, the fact that you don't pay for bond insurance because of that good credit rating, but rough rule of thumb is 2% for cost of issuance of the principal amount that you're issuing.
Thank you.
And then the last page, page 6, is just a sample motion that would authorize the finance team to get the paperwork in order to follow that timeline at the earliest that I laid out previously for a new money issue of $9,995,000, which gets adjusted based on the final pricing. Sometimes there's premiums, so the principal amount turns out to be less than that, but it will never be more than that in order to get the bank qualified rates in the 5-year call.
This would be a motion that we would do on Monday.
In your timeline, Jamie, I think this is the October
Yes, I had it.
item. Does it matter
I
which
mean,
month you
it's
do
at
it?
your discretion,
Okay.
but I had it on October 28th.
October's fine with me. Fine.
If we do it sooner, we would have that much more flexibility in case there's some reason to do it sooner, but it seems like we don't want to go out to market until January anyway, so it probably doesn't matter.
We can't even do this until after January, right, Jamie?
Oh, not if we want to do bank qualified.
Not for bank qualified.
You could technically have the sale at the beginning of December, but I wouldn't recommend it. The market just gets too messy.
October.
Since the meeting's Monday, it's already Thursday, I think adding the motion if we don't have to, might be easy just to wait.
I just want to make one observation. I brought with me your sheet from the July 2017 presentation, which was the first time we discussed new money for Sandy Run. And that was at the time a total of 70,000 borrowing instead of 75,000. A million. Yeah. And the peak local effort in that chart was 13,600,000 in 2021, and the peak in this new chart is 13,700,000 in 2023, even though there's 5 million more borrowing. So it goes to the conservative estimates early on and the favorable rates that we're looking at now. But overall, it looks strong.
Are there any other questions Selectman, Ms. Doyle. Stan?
Laura, thanks for pointing that out. That's good information.
Anyone else with any questions? Thank you so much, James.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to proceed then with the next item on the agenda, which is announcements. Mr. Leckman, do we have any announcements?
There are no announcements this evening.
And there are no minutes. There are no minutes, since we didn't have a meeting last month. Okay, so we're going right on to the committee report recommendations. Mr. Leckman, you want to start with the treasurer's reports?
Sure. So in your packet tonight are the treasurer's reports for July and August. And these will be, you'll have the treasurer's reports as part of the finance committee packet at each month, which go on to the board packet as well for review and approval. I don't intend to go through these in a whole lot of detail. They're out there for you to look at and go through and ask questions. I think similar to the Sandy Run Middle School budget, I'll cover any items we need to highlight, just any items that I want to bring your attention to, and then certainly open it up to see if there's any questions. So this month, the only one I really want to bring your attention to, because I think it's noteworthy, and we're still talking to our tax collector to get an answer to this, is in the August report, the August treasurer's report, if you look at the real estate tax revenue number line item, you can see that we are about $4 or $5 million less collected as of the end of August this year as compared to last year. So that's something noteworthy, and that's something that we're looking at with our tax collector to understand what happened there. But again, it's a big change from last year to this year, and we're just trying to get some information to make sure we understand that. On the expenditure side of the ledger, we're exactly where we were last year. We have about 7% of our expenses to date spent versus last year, 7%. So that number is right in line. On the interest side of those, I think it's noteworthy, just to let you know that the Fed reduced interest rates, again, just yesterday. And I think it's split right now, but there's talk about another interest rate reduction in December. So again, while that has some positive impact on the borrowing side of the ledger, we also have a significant revenue line item in our budget that's based around the 2% interest rate. So that's something, as interest rates go down, we'll see less revenue on that line item. So pluses and minuses to interest rate changes, especially as we're going through Sandy Run. Any questions on either of the treasurer's reports?
I'm anxious to hear what Berkheimer, is he, or this is,
Real estate taxes.
this is real, yeah,
My client.
my client,
Could just
yeah,
be
that's,
timing
you're
between
not concerned by
last year and
that
this year.
number, it's just a timing thing.
Yeah.
Wow.
I'll talk to him and find out.
Yeah, because the discount period goes through the end of August. So, people, you'd be surprised how many people wait right up until the end to pay those bills. And, depending on when, I guess depending on when that date fell too, it's possible that created some of the delay.
In capital projects fund, how much, is there an estimate in terms of how much we still have to pay out for the summer projects? I've seen that decline, I'm sure you've been making payments, but is there a lot more to go?
I don't have that off the top of my head. I can certainly find that out though.
We still have 6.7 in capital projects and 9.9, 9.9, I guess, in capital, 2 of those are the bond funds, and then debt service, we have the 4.4. Yeah. I also remember last year, we did have a motion to look at the end of the year and then consider additional rate stabilization transfer.
Correct. So that'll be part of, and again, I'll cover this as part of the budget update. We just went through our financial audit. So after we close out the audit and we have all of our final numbers, I would think by next month we would make a recommendation on if we want to add any additional monies to those committed fund balances for either rate stabilization or the other one is assessment appeals.
We haven't touched that 960,000 in
Right.
forever.
This may be a budget update question also, but do you anticipate revising the interest income number in this year's, or the estimate in this year's budget as a result of the rate changes?
I haven't typically made any adjustments to revenue budget line items. I think that's just something as we progress through the year, we would monitor actual to budget and just see how that's trending and report if we think it's going to be significantly less than budget, so we understand what that impact would be.
Thank you.
We're already at 23% in the interest.
That's correct.
Yes, I think we probably will be good.
Well, it's going to start good and tail off. It's
Well,
probably
It's only 2 months. It's only 2 months.
And again, our highest cash balances are from the end of August, until December timeframe, because we get 80% of our tax collections by the end of August, so.
Mark, are you wondering if we would change our assumptions going into next year's budget, or are you talking about?
Well, that's a follow-up, that's also a good follow-up question, that's not what I was asking, but yeah, I mean, as we get into next year's budget development, we probably don't make as great an assumption for interest income, I'm thinking.
That'll absolutely be part of the budget discussion.
Are there any other questions on this? Okay. Move on.
Okay, moving on to the 2018-2019 financial review. So as I mentioned, we just the last 2 days, so I think Jen is very happy to have our day completed today. We had our auditors on site for the last 2 days, our annual financial audit. They brought 8 people. They were very, very efficient, but that's a lot of people to manage over 2 days and get that work done. So if you've never been part of an audit, you can't possibly understand all the work that goes into that. So kudos to Jen for managing that process very well. I got good feedback. We got good feedback from the auditors and where things stand. So I think that's why at this point we're comfortable at least giving you an update, giving the board an update on the unaudited numbers subject to change, but we don't expect any material changes at this point. And just walk through where we closed out the year and then open it up to any questions. So. A couple reports that are in this document. I think 2 are probably new to you, and the third page is something that you've seen as part of the treasurer's report on a monthly basis. The first page, it says general fund summary at the top, is a report I like to use on a regular basis to give the reader of these documents an understanding of trend from the past, and then eventually what will happen is this sheet will start to show projections as we go through our assumptions on the budget. So getting back to Mr. Schroeder's point is, once we start making changes to interest rate and other changes, tax collections, millage changes, expense changes, we'll start to play this out into a 3 to 5 year projection. And then we'll also have a software that we'll implement in the near future that'll do some of that work for us too, but it'll be in a similar format. So the top part of this form shows you the fund balance, past fund balance, then it shows you the trends of revenues, trends of expenses. I like to break out fund transfers as a completely separate line item in both of these reports that you see here, so you understand actual revenues, actual expenses, what the net of that is, and then look at the transfers after that. So if you look at the unaudited 18-19 column, you can see that our revenues for the year were $101,260,000. Expenditures for the year were $99,159,000, and the excess was a little over $2.1 million. There were also fund transfers, which the board authorized last year, of $3.179 million that went to 2 separate places. We had some of it go to the Capital Reserve Fund, some of it go to the Debt Service Fund. So at the end of the year, where that leaves us is an unassigned fund balance of a little over $6.1 million. And then back to the point of we have 2 committed fund balances of Health Stabilization Fund and Real Estate Assessments, which leaves us with a total ending fund balance of $9,663,000 and change. So, and then I listed the budget on here again. I know we talked about some of that, but you can see where the budget lays out for next year with a net change in fund balance of about $3.2 million. Yes, $1.4 million of that is scheduled as transfer, but to the point, that 1.4 million becomes an expense next year, and 3.2 million is sort of our starting place before we add on, salaries, benefits, those types of contractual changes, any other increases that we'll see, or start talking about millage increases, or any other revenue items. Okay? The second sheet of this is, so now I get into a little more, because I hear the question often, and it's a good question, is, okay, you've shown me the actuals and you've shown me the budget for next year, but where's the budget to actual review, and what types of things are driving the differences between what we budgeted and what we actually saw? So this report gives you a history of revenue budget to actual, expense budget to actual, and then gets down into your budget surplus. And then I have a box at the bottom that gives you the highlights of 18-19 and explains some of the variances to the budget year to date, so you can see what's driving some of these things. So on the revenue item, you can see that while we have actual revenue of $101,260,000, we budgeted $99,916,000. So we came in $1,300,000 better than budget. And then where that's coming from, you can see, real estate tax collections were about $200,000 to the positive. And to put that in perspective, that's like 0.25%, different from what we budgeted. So big numbers, small variance, percentage-wise. $680,000 of that was interim real estate tax collections. So, this was a year where we had a bunch of assessment appeals come through that were to the positive for the school district. So that's not revenue that we can continue to expect going forward. It was just a one-year, win for the district as far as revenue. EIT collections were $330,000 better, but I noted here that this 19-20 budget, there was a pretty significant increase on that revenue line item in the 19-20 budget. So some of that will be closed up this year. $135,000 on delinquent real estate taxes. So you can see again, the 19-20 budget was increased to account for some of how delinquent taxes are being collected. And then $430,000 of interest income, and there was a pretty significant increase on that revenue line in the 19-20 budget as well. As far as the negative there, so I'm sure I don't have to go through the details of this, but we do get a subsidy back from the state for our retirement contributions and FICA contributions. As you'll see on the expenditure side of the ledger, as our salaries were under budget, those line items are going to naturally be under budget on the revenue subsidy that comes back to us because expenses are low. Okay. On the expense side of the ledger, we had a budget of $102,273,000, actual of $99,159,000. So our variance on the expense side was a little over $3 million, which is about 3% of our total budget. And then I gave you some updates here on where that's coming from. $675,000 on salaries from unfilled positions. On especially the teacher side of the ledger, we have to plan for, if someone goes out on a leave and we have to have a sub in to fill them. So we have to have some line items in the budget to cover those types of things. So that's where some of our savings come from there. $800,000 on benefits, $300,000 on medical and prescription, $240,000 on PSERS and FICA doing the salary being under budget, and $225,000 on workers' compensation, which is something we'll take a little closer look at as we go through the budget this year. But I will tell you that workers' compensation, we did have a pretty good year last year on workers' compensation. So I think there's probably some room to adjust our budget down here, but last year was a good year for us. And then $1.38 million across all other areas of the budget. And again, without going through line by line, one of the things I note here is that there were definitely adjustments made in this year's budget as compared to last year, because if you look at the 19-20 expense budget compared to the 18-19 expense actual, it's less than a 1% increase between actual to budget. So some of that will naturally be closed up by the budget work that was done last year. Okay, and then you see the fund transfers on the bottom there. And again, the last page is just a June audited update treasurer's report. So it just ties out to all other documents. So I won't go through that in detail. And I'll stop there and ask if there's any questions.
It's a very helpful charts. Tables.
Tables, schedules, thank you.
The significant payment to Prudential was made, has been made. So it's in the 18, 19, or is that coming up?
So we didn't make a payment to Prudential, we agreed to tax credits. So that's reflected, it was reflected in the
Okay.
1920 revenue budget, so
Okay.
we're not actually getting a payment from them this year. Their payment is completely wiped out with a tax credit.
Right, and that was, you remember how much that was? Is that over a million?
It's total $1.8 million, but it'll have a two-year,
Over 2 years.
it'll have a two-year impact because it's going back to them in credits.
And then once that's said and done, the lost revenue from Prudential is over 600.
That's correct,
Right.
on an annual basis, recurring basis.
Right.
I greatly appreciate your separating out fund transfers after a subtotal, so we can see that separately. Another similar thing that has tripped board members up in the past is the reimbursements from the state for PSERS and FICA, that it looks like an expense, a bigger expense than it is net, and then the awkward half of it coming back in revenue. And I wonder if there's an opportunity to, not on this sheet, but that same concept I think would be helpful to show elsewhere when we talk about the expense of PSERS and FICA, especially PSERS since it's growing so quickly. I had a question, but now I have to find it. Somebody else has something.
Yeah, I'll just respond real quick. I mean, that piece about PSERS and the expense and the revenue, I mean, they're two separate things, we have to show them separately, but when we start talking about some of the budget, I will, show you a chart that shows you, yep, here's the expense, here's the revenue, just so you understand it works together. And yes, it's a huge expense, but we do get a bit of that back from the state, so it's a fair point.
Any other questions?
So there were, going back to Joan's point, the 1.17 mils I thought that we put aside. Part of it is the 1.4, then the other part was the hub and the lifetime. So a good portion of that is being spent on part 1 and part 2 of the bonds. So I think that's why you're saying, we can't count it twice, and when you use that, we're still at a 3.2 deficit.
Whatever millage
Yeah.
increases have already been approved are in the revenue side of the budget. That's correct.
Right.
So it's already built into the revenue. It's not like we're going to get anything additional in the future from that.
Any other questions? Mark?
So I observed that I love this second chart with the budget to actuals going back several years, and I think there's a portion of the community that's going to really like that too, because that is a question that comes up every year at May and June meetings. So I observed that the variance on revenue is not atypical last year. The variance on expense is massive. And I do remember that low year in 15-16, I remember Brenda saying, oh my God, that was way too close. But 3 million is way too high, I'm thinking, or is that an okay number? Like, how do you feel about being off by 3 million on the expense side?
So I would rather be that way. I would say, I'll be very honest, I take the position that, in the position that we're in as a school district, when we set a budget, you are setting a number and you cannot spend beyond it. So naturally, you have to set a conservative budget that you will underspend because you're really not authorized to spend beyond that once it's set. $3 million, it's a little under 3%. It's a little high, I would agree, but that's why I point out that I think some of those adjustments were made in the 1920 budget because it's such a small increase expense actual to budget being less than 1%. So I can't say with certainty today, but I think naturally that'll come down to a smaller number this year. And as we go through the budget process this year, we will look at that and figure out kind of where specifically some of those variances are and start to drill down into that a little bit.
Any further questions?
So we transferred a lot last year, Ms. Brady.
Yeah.
Can you comment, do you think we transferred maybe, was it the appropriate amount? Because that's part of the reason, right, that we're at 3.2 in the red. If we didn't transfer that money, would it still be available? It's not an expense, or?
So those transfers don't have anything to do with that $3.2
$3.2
million. The
Okay.
transfers are impacting your fund balance at the bottom. So you have less fund balance available to be, appropriated as a result of those transfers.
Right.
So good, bad, or indifferent, I think ultimately one of the things we need to do this year is define our goals around the debt service fund, the capital reserve fund, what we think those funds should ultimately grow to, what they should be used for. So I think there's some work we need to do around setting that this year. So I don't think it's good, bad, or indifferent. I think it's always good to have money set aside for.
But if
Things
we
like
didn't do some of those transfers, which I'm not saying we shouldn't have, we could have used that money to pay some of the bad assessments that we had to deal with. Where where they settled and we had to owe money.
So yes and no from my perspective, right? One-time type payments, but again, that's affecting your fund balance. I think my philosophy on fund balance is it should be used for more one-type expenses. As soon as you start using fund balance to pay for recurring expenses, you're going to run out of money eventually. So yes, you have more fund balance at the end of the day. I think it's the same concept.
Right, and the interim real estate, that is also when homes settle over the year, if we have a significant number of homes that are settling, that also is a good guide for the interim.
Absolutely. We have a budget for that. Now, there's a budgeted revenue line item, so if more homes settle or there's more work being done to homes, it helps, for sure.
Yeah, which I hope in the future with you being here, Andy, that we can be a little bit more proactive in terms of what's in the market, what we project in terms of settling, reaching out to some of the new developments, and when are the closings, when do they think they're going to be closing, to give us a better estimate for those interims and future property taxes.
I think it's helpful to know that information. I always want to be conservative, though, to not get out ahead of that, right? We want to be lagging that a little bit. We don't want to be spending money before it comes into it becomes real revenue.
Correct. It's not here till it's here.
Correct.
Do you get a report on everything that has settled, all the changes, like every month?
We get reports from the county on transfer taxes. So anytime a home settles, we get a transfer tax off of that, and then we get a report that backs up everything that's settled that month. Yes.
Is it possible to somehow integrate that information into what you present each month? Or do you think that's not that relevant?
It's a lot of information. Could we create some summary number of homes sold, average market value of the home that's sold? I'm sure we could come up with that if the board finds that to be useful information.
I got that every month at the township.
The full report or just a summary of what happened?
Of every house. The tax revenue, transfer tax of every house sold.
That's what we get as well. It's very detailed. We have to break it down to summarize it.
Is that something?
Then you know what your neighbor's houses went for. Even before, it's months before it's even in the newspapers. And I would tell my friends, oh, yeah, so-and-so's house went for.
From a school board point of view, I think it is interesting to look at long-term trends of houses sold and average prices and that kind of thing.
It can be
But I don't know that that's
helpful.
going to really affect our budgetary decisions and that kind of thing, but it's interesting.
I mean, the Montgomery County site is very helpful. I go on that maybe once a month, and you can search for Upper Dublin, homes that were sold in a particular period of time, and you can see the number of homes and what the selling prices were, and you can go in and look at each detail too, in terms of what property taxes are generated. So that's a great, to see just in terms of trends and how many homes sold in Upper Dublin in July. How many sold, in June. You always see in summertime is when there's a lot of activity.
And that's why I think maybe we start with a summary report, and we can start to track trends, high-level
Right.
trends, not number of homes, average market value, stuff like that, maybe low, high home that sold that month, stuff like that. We can come up with something and share that and just see if that's useful information.
Like,
Or anything in the business.
like Washington Manor, which I think they're almost, where are we now with Washington Manor in terms of how many have sold, how many have settled, compared to what we anticipated, and when we see, when will more of them, when is settlement for a lot of the other homes, or are we done in Washington Manor? I have no clue. I know in Regency, it's just a few more settlements that are coming. In the Enclave at the Promenade, which don't even have roads yet, they've sold 17 units already. They won't go to settlement probably for 8 months or a year.
Some of that, as a summary, is somewhat interesting, even though you don't want to project when things in the future will hit. But at least the things that we know are in the pipeline, it's kind of like a budget number. There are things that we would expect to get assessment at some point in the future. I think knowing some of those things is helpful in terms of budgeting. And it's not because I want to know what my neighbor sold their house at, because I can look that up anyway.
Well, as far as looking at new developments, I agree, knowing some of that is very important. As far as transfer tax, the thing about some of that stuff is that's all good now because the market is still roaring as far as homes and new builds and stuff like that. But 10 years ago, you had a huge drop off when you went through the housing crisis. So we can project and look at trends, but for the last 10 years, the trends are going to look great, and it's until they don't.
The bottom line is, what is our total assessed value in Upper Dublin? And I think you've indicated hasn't changed much.
That's correct.
Okay. No further questions?
I just want to thank Andy for, this is really helpful. It's really good.
I was actually going to say that before. I look back to see when in previous years we would see this level of detail of information, and this is adding a degree of transparency around the budget that I think is going to be really welcomed by our community. And it also helps us internally when we're having conversations with our leadership team as we get ready to construct next year's budget.
Right, and as you hinted there, I think we're probably 2 or 3 months earlier at least than typical. Yeah, which is fantastic.
Yes. And now we're ready to talk about the development of the budget.
So it comes quicker and quicker every year, we feel like. But yes, it's that time of year where we're starting to talk about budget for 2021. So what you have before you is it's a draft timeline of what we're going to be going through as far as the budget process. So basically the key date that we need to look at right now is January 2020. That is the date by which we need to decide if we're going to we need to have a preliminary budget passed if we're going to go down the preliminary budget route. December 20th would be the date that we need if we're going to go through the opt-out resolution, which I think has been to stay within the index, is when we have to pass that opt-out resolution if we want to stay within the index for next year. So once we know those dates, then that's as you build the timeline, you just build back from there. So that's really the key decision point I think that we have in the budget process. And then you can see everything in here about how we're going to work through it. I think we already know the Act 1 index for next year. It's been set at 2.6%, which is a slight increase, which is a good thing. But I know Ms. Spray talked to you last year about the IFO projections that were put out last year. The IFO for Pennsylvania put out some projections on what the Act 1 index would be, and the projection was 2.8%. So it's a nice increase, but it's slightly below what the IFO was projecting. So it's still a good number as school districts work through budgets for next year, but that's kind of what it looks like. And then ultimately, this wraps up with a lot of work throughout the year, a lot of iterative work, a lot of prep and presentations here at the Finance Committee to a final budget, and a proposed final budget in May, and then a final budget in June. So that's what we're looking at for this year. Questions on that?
Yeah, Andy, would you know what, if with the referendum exceptions, is there an estimate that you'd know in November?
In November, absolutely, we can have an estimate for you. Again, just an estimate. We don't give, PDE obviously certifies the final numbers and everything, but certainly we can have an estimate at that time.
Except for exceptions.
Yeah, for
So
exceptions.
that exceptions for PSERS and special
Do we still
education.
qualify? I thought we didn't qualify for special ed for a while. And so it would just be PSERS, probably?
Yeah, and even PSERS is, I mean, salaries are going up, but PSERS is getting smaller and smaller as the employer rate is leveling out, so.
Is it the case that we have to have that resolution a month or so earlier than usual because the presidential election years, you have to back off from when is it primary or the election?
So we're a whole month, this year's process is a whole month earlier than it typically would be, yes.
Any questions then, Mark?
Just not a question, but a comment. I'll just take this opportunity to make the annual comment that I make every year. When the Act 1 index is published, we did anticipate, based on IFO reports for the last 2 years, that it would be on the rise, and I've been advocating that we should be tying our tax increase to the index rather than trying to decrease every year. So this past year, we already didn't decrease. We broke that long-term trend that we had going since 2011, I want to say, 2009 or something like that. So with the index going up, I think we should anticipate that, the community should anticipate that our tax increase next year will be larger than it was this current year. At least that's what I'll be advocating for. And I, as I said before, I think my intention is to try to develop a budget towards about 90% of the index.
Any other comments or questions? No? Okay. Thank you very much.
Yep, the last item here is a contract, an agreement for appraisal services with Valbridge, Lukens, and Wolf. So as the board's well aware, we have a number of properties that are in some stage of assessment appeal. And this would be an agreement where at a stage with one of our properties here that we need, 502 Office Center Drive, that we need to go get an appraisal done so we can work on a potential settlement, or at least have our data for our side to work through that process. So the cost of this appraisal is right in line with, you've used this firm in the past, is $5,000 in total, that it's not to exceed $5,000. That's $2,500 for a verbal report, and if we need an actual written report, it would be an additional $2,500. So it's a maximum of $5,000.
Anyone have any comments or questions on this? Is this agreement, will this be on Monday? For us
Yes.
to approve? Okay.
Yes, it will.
So we need to move it forward if it's okay with the committee? It's okay. All right.
I do have a question though. On the Office Center Drive buildings, a lot of those were redone. I don't know if that made the value of them go up, or if we're looking at past years when they were undervalued. Is this, which way is this? This is them wanting a reduction.
So yes, this is
Okay.
one of the assessment appeals where the owner of the property has submitted an appeal to reduce the value. And I did have that here, I'm sorry. It's where the owner is at right now, it's a potential loss revenue of about $19,000 annually.
Is it for past years? Or is it going forward every year?
It goes back 1 year.
Is this one of the buildings that was rehabbed? I mean, did they, should it be one that's decreasing in value? I guess that's my,
So that's part of the appraisal process. That's why we needed an appraisal.
But Joan, you're remembering several other buildings on Off Center Drive that have gone through this process. This is not one of them that has gone through it, at least recently.
Okay, so if we have no more questions on this, we will move that forward. We are now up to community input. If there's anyone who's interested in coming to the microphone, no. There being none, does anyone have any final comments or questions? If not, then I will say that the next Finance Committee meeting will be Thursday, October 24th at 7 p.m., right after operations, and we are therefore adjourned.